What would Dr. David Livingstone say to us today? Isaiah 6 verse 8. Also I heard the voice of the Lord saying, whom shall I send, and who will go for us? Then I said, here am I, send me. As we seek to put feet to our faith, Dr. David Livingstone is an example of excellence. His life, his legacy, his literature continue to speak to us today. The challenge of Dr. Livingstone is most relevant to our times. If Dr. David Livingstone was here at Back to the Bible Mission today, what do you think he would say to us? We do not need to guess. We have his writings. We have his published statements available. We can know exactly what David Livingstone would say to us today. It's what he said to the people of his day. The salvation of men ought to be the chief desire and aim of every Christian. All men have the right to hear God's word. No nation ought to hoard God's word like a miser. Can the love of Christ not carry the missionary where the slave trade carries the slave trader? A mission wrote to him saying, do you have a good road to where you are? If so, we have men who want to come and join you. David Livingstone wrote back saying, if you have men who will come only if they know there's a good road, I don't want them. I want men who will come even if there's no road at all. In a letter to his sisters, he wrote, we must be uncommon Christians, that is, eminently holy and devoted servants of the Most High. Let us seek that selfishness be extirpated, pride banished, unbelief driven from the mind, every idol dethroned, everything hostile to holiness, everything opposed to the divine will crucified, that holiness to the Lord may be engraved on the heart and evermore characterize our whole conduct. We still have a debt of gratitude to Jesus. There is no greater privilege on earth than, after having our own chains broken off, to go forth and to proclaim liberty to the captives, the opening of prison to them that are bound. Dr. David Livingstone was inspired by an optimistic view of the future. Like most of the missionaries of the 19th century, he held to an eschatology of victory, eschatology, study of the last days, study of last things. Discoveries and inventions are cumulative, he wrote, filling the earth with the glory of the Lord. All nations will sing his glory and bow before him. Our work and its fruit are cumulative. We work towards a new state of things. Future missionaries will be rewarded by conversions for every sermon. We are their pioneers and their helpers. Let them not forget the watchmen of the night, who worked when all was gloom and no evidence of success in the way of conversions shares our path. They will doubtless have more light than we, but we serve our Master earnestly, and we proclaim the same gospel they will do. In his diary he wrote, a quiet audience today. The seed is being sown, the least of all seeds now, but it will grow into a mighty tree. It is as if it were a small stone cut out of a mountain, but it will fill the whole earth. We work for a glorious future, which we are not destined to see. The golden age which has not yet been, but which will yet be. We are only morning stars shining in the dark. But the glorious morn will break. The good time is coming yet. The dominion has been given by the power of commerce and population unto the people of the saints of the Most High. This is an everlasting kingdom, a little stone cut out of the mountain without hands, which will cover the whole earth. For this time we work. By different agencies, the great ruler is bringing all things into focus. Jesus is gathering all things to himself, and he is daily becoming more and more the center of the world's fears and of the world's hopes. According to Operation World, today there are 500 million people in Africa who claim to be Christians. This includes 150 million Protestants, 50 million Anglicans, 140 million Charismatics, 60 million Pentecostals, and 100 million Independents. But when David Livingstone began his work in Africa, there were barely 5 million Christians in all of Africa. David Livingstone ploughed in stony ground. He sowed the gospel seed that has produced a great harvest. Psalm 22 declares, all the ends of the world will remember and turn to the Lord, and all the families of the nations shall worship before you. For the kingdom is the Lord's, and he rules over the nations. The life and the legacy of David Livingstone has changed my life. As a new Christian, I was converted in 1977. I imbibed many of the presuppositions and tendencies of churches in the 1970s. I read the late great Planet Earth, There's a New World Coming, Satan is Alive and Well on Planet Earth, and other date-setting, end-times, rapture fever publications. I was convinced we were living in the last days, the last hours. I was saved. I loved the Lord. I was enthusiastically involved in evangelism, but my understanding of biblical doctrines was actually quite shallow. I imbibed the prevailing prejudice against Calvinism and was convinced that we were living in the last days. Therefore, at that time, I could not consider having children, getting married. Simply wasn't enough time. I could not allow myself to be distracted by worldly matters, such as family and raising children in my mind. I needed to devote my last few days on earth to snatching souls from the fire. This was an obsession. Many of us in the 1970s, living in the last days, we're watching films like A Thief in the Night, Distant Thunder, singing songs like I Wish We'd All Been reading books like Late Great Planet Earth. The rapture was coming surely before the end of that year. I was completely closed to the idea of theological training. What was the point? The Lord would have come before I'd finished my studies. Better to stay in the field winning souls in these last few days remaining, I thought. Then I read The Puritan Hope, Revival and Interpretation of Prophecy by Ian Murray, published by Banner of Truth, which produced a lot of great, good Christian classics. This book informed me all of the pioneer missionaries of the 19th century were Calvinist and post-millennial. Now, I had no idea what post-millennial meant, but when I read that the father of modern missions, William Carey, and the best friend Africa ever had, the great missionary pioneer Dr. David Livingstone, that they were both reformed and post-millennial, I determined to read up more on these matters. Earlier, I'd read a thin, modern biography on David Livingstone, which did not seem too extraordinary, because like many modern books, it had been sanitized. All controversial, politically incorrect details had been omitted. The modern censored version of Livingstone's life did not mention the ravages of the Islamic slave trade, which David Livingstone confronted, documented, and fought against. It left out his Calvinist convictions and his post-millennial eschatology victory. The modern biographies left out the fact that David Livingstone came to Africa with a 6-barreled revolver and a double-barreled rifle, which he used in fighting Islamic slave traders. His violent confrontations with Islamic slave traders, his bold initiatives to set thousands of captives free, were also apparently deemed too controversial to include in modern, sanitized, abridged versions of Livingstone's life. However, I've always been a bookworm. I've had a love for history, and finding most books available in the average bookshop today to be quite shallow and predictable, I've developed a preference for sorting through second-hand bookshops, finding rare old first editions of missionary pioneers. I was reading Livingstone's missionary travels, as I was following in much of his footsteps in Tet province in Mozambique in the Zambezi Valley in 1989. That was when I and the medical team I was leading were captured by Russian forces, imprisoned in SNASP security prison in Mashava in Maputo. What I learned from the writings and the exemplary life, the extraordinary legacy of David Livingstone, transformed my life and my ministry. So what did I learn from David Livingstone? I learned from David Livingstone the importance of discipline. He was disciplined in reading and in exercise. He was self-controlled. David Livingstone was a teetotaler. He abstained from alcohol for life. He was temperate. He was duty-orientated, and he was hard-working. Livingstone's work ethic is a rebuke to us all. From age 10, he worked full-time, overtime, 14 hours a day, 6 days a week, walking an average of 34 kilometers every day, much of this in a crawling or stooping position, amongst or under the machinery or bouncing over it. Imagine the tremendous physical training this was for his later transcontinental expeditions throughout Africa. And he did all this in the steamed heat and humidity considered essential for the production of thread. He worked in a cotton mill. David Livingstone used his first week's wages to purchase a book on Latin, Rudiments of Latin. Less than 10% of the children working in the cotton mills ever learned to read or write at all. He didn't just learn to read and write. David Livingstone learned Greek and Hebrew and Latin. Every night after work, he'd attend a night school from 8 p.m. to 10 p.m. What are you doing between 8 and 10 p.m.? Then at home he would study off until midnight. Every morning began at 5:30 a.m. when the bell rang and they had to prepare for work at the cotton mill at 6. Now, his mother kept him out of work until he was 10, which is older than most. Many went to the cotton mill at age 6. David, at age 9, was sitting on the banks of the river, the Clyde River, reading, when his reading was startled by a scream of a young girl. A young girl was having an adventure with a baby brother, a toddler brother, rowing a boat and had lost her oars, and the boat was being sucked towards the paddle wheel of the mill. And of course the boat would be crushed, and so would this girl and her baby brother. David didn't hesitate. He plunged into icy waters, and he rescued this little girl and boy, took them to their parents, and never said a word about it the rest of his life. The only reason we know about this is because David Livingstone's father, Neil Livingstone, was asked to give a testimonial about his son, and he mentioned this because the parents of the boy and girl came to the home to thank them. That's how the parents learned about it, not from David. And this letter is still in the files of the London Missionary Society, which was uncovered recently. And so this little-known part of Livingstone's life came out not that long ago. When he was studying medicine and theology, he would walk from Blantyre to Glasgow, refusing every offer of a ride on horseback and carts passing by. He preferred the 4-hour walk to work, often in the snow, in order to strengthen his muscles for his chosen career in missions. Now, he had built up tremendous strength for a lifetime of working. He wasn't going to let his studies have his muscles deteriorate. So instead of taking a lift, he would rather choose to walk. That's how disciplined he was. David Livingstone never accepted charity, although he was brought up in the poorest of circumstances. His family of 7 were forced to live in a single room, this room, 10 foot by 14 feet. No electricity, no plumbing, no running water. His parents' bed underneath had several mattresses stored, and the mattresses would be pulled out at night for his brother and sisters. That was the whole room. They had no kitchen, bathroom, no sink, no running water at all. He worked and he saved, and he put himself through both medical school and theological college. David was the first worker from the cotton mills to receive a university education, and nobody gave it to him. There were no bursaries, there were no scholarships. He had to save up and put himself through it. He earned it. He passed with high honours. He received his doctorate from the Royal Faculty of Physicians and Surgeons, November 1840. He was ordained as a congregational minister the 20th of November 1840. Against all odds, David Livingstone achieved far more than anyone would have thought humanly possible. For somebody born to such a poverty-stricken, disadvantaged background. This is his family home. His family had one room here in this tenement. They shared this tenement with 26 other families. There was only one source of water, a pump in the courtyard. And every drop of water they needed for washing, cooking, cleaning, drinking had to be carried by his brother or him in buckets up from the well, up the circular steps. They were at the top floor at the far side. He did not wait for somebody else to open up Africa. He didn't wait for someone to invent a 4-wheel drive vehicle. He didn't wait for somebody to build roads and bridges. He drew the first maps of the Zambezi River. He did not have an attitude of entitlement. David Livingstone had a Protestant work ethic. When David Livingstone came to Africa, people's knowledge of Africa was pathetically distorted. These were the kind of maps of Africa that existed through history. Not much knowledge at all. South of Egypt, people didn't have a clue. And these were actual maps of Africa. Can you imagine? Even in the 16th century, the maps of Africa were so bad. When you go to the Kruger National Park today, they say this is the Nile crocodile. Now, of course, they've got nothing to do with the Nile, but they're called the Nile crocodile because when the Dutch first came across these crocodiles, they assumed they were Nile crocodiles because they thought the Limpopo River was the headwaters of the Nile. Many people, even in the 16th century, thought that the mountains of the moon were basically where Zimbabwe is today. They seriously thought the Nile came all the way down to South Africa. In fact, many maps of the 19th century were big blank areas in the middle with unexplored or unknown written in the middle. David Livingstone filled in the map. The prevailing assumption of most geographers in the 19th century was the middle of Africa is one big desert. And David Livingstone's the one who filled in the map. No, there's rivers and there's mountains and there's lakes and there's plateaus and escarpments. David Livingstone opened up Africa to the world's understanding. He drew the first map of the Zambezi River from source all the way to the mouth of the river north of Beira on the Indian Ocean. How did he do this? He used a sextant to determine position at night with the stars, and he always had a thermometer in the water when he's boiling water for tea or whatever, and he observed calculated what altitude they were at. And his maps today, if you put it next to the satellite maps, his maps are accurate. David Livingstone, following the Zambezi all the way down from its source in Angola down to Mozambique, he came across this great pillar of smoke, of water vapor. Asked the people, what is that? Local villagers said, Musi or Yatanya, the smoke that thunders. What makes the smoke to thunder? Spirits. Have you been there? No. Nobody wanted to go there. They thought the place was bewitched. And it was thunderous. I mean, even you go now towards Lake Victoria, Victoria Falls, the sound of thunder, of millions of gallons of water pouring over, plummeting down 300 feet. It's a thunderous roar, and it can be intimidating if you don't know what's there. And the people were quite superstitious. So Livingstone borrowed a canoe and went close to the edge and beached his canoe just in time on what today is called Livingstone Island. And he crawled out to the end and he looked out on a spectacle that he said, angels at creation must have gazed at such wonders in flight. He said the most magnificent, awe-inspiring sight he'd ever seen in his life anywhere. Now, this picture of these men standing around with spears, that's very imaginative, but there was no one else with him. He was on his own. But this is just the way some artists depicted it later. There's Livingstone Island. He crawled to the edge and looked out from the edge. Here's another view. That's the view. Livingstone crawled to the edge of that and he was ready. He dropped down a weighted string and he measured out 310 feet. Can you imagine? And on that edge, here's his map, which I've got in Livingstone's Missionary Travels, his first book. He's worked out, you see at the bottom, Victoria Falls, 1,860 yards wide. That's what it is. It is 310 feet deep. That's what it is. You can't improve in his measurements. He's quite right. Even with our satellites and our GPSs today, we can't improve in the measurements of David Livingstone. I mean, how do you pace out a waterfall? I mean, how did he measure it? Extraordinary. He didn't even have someone else, you hold this side and I'm going to go the other side. But he is that accurate. He worked out how many paces between each of the different gorges, and more than that, he gave sketches. I get this book, I've got an original first edition of Livingstone's Travels, and there is no elevation where you can get this perspective. So he had to not just sketch what he saw, but to give people a perspective, he had to project himself up where, obviously they didn't have microlights or what do we call these things, these drones. So you know how hard it is to sketch what you see, but to sketch what you could not see, that takes real skill. And that's what it is. He is accurate. This is also in his book, to show how many gorges wrap around afterwards. Again, there's no hill or elevation from which he could get this view. He had to imagine and project it to help people get an understanding of the depth of what he was depicting. But with the aid of helicopters and microlights today, we can see that what Livingstone drew was absolutely accurate. On his second missionary journey, he was given the greatest artist of the Victorian era, Thomas Baines, to go with him. Queen Victoria sent Thomas Baines out to paint Victoria Falls, that was named after her. And Thomas Baines depicted this showing incredible vegetation, but also phenomenal concentration of animals, as shown here. It was a wildlife sanctuary, proving that probably very few people went there. There was vast herds of animals. In all Livingstone's travels around Africa, nowhere had a greater concentration of animals than around Victoria Falls, showing that hunters probably didn't go there. There were probably so much superstitious fear that this area was a real sanctuary of wildlife. Now, there are people who say, how can you talk about David Livingstone discovering Victoria Falls? Everyone knew about Victoria Falls. Well, actually, he might have been the first to see it. He certainly was the first to name it, to map it, to sketch it, to make it known to the world. And Victoria Falls will always be associated with the name of David Livingstone, which is why there's monuments on both sides of the falls to him. There's a perpetual rainbow there at Victoria Falls, very impressive scenery. This is Devil's Cataract. I remember in 1972 when I first saw Victoria Falls, there was quite a bit of talk because an American film company had just gone over the edge at Devil's Cataract. The filmmaker, the producer, they were filming, they got too close to the edge and the torrent just pulled them over the edge, and the whole boat with the film crew, the director, the producer, the cameraman, all went right over Devil's Cataract, never seen again. Can you imagine? In fact, I asked the local people, do people go over the edge? And they said, oh, all the time. I said, but we never read about that. No, they said, that's not good for tourism, but people fall over the edge at Victoria Falls all the time, apparently. You're talking about thousands of tons of water going over the falls every minute. It's absolutely staggering. To be there, I've been there regularly and been so soaked from the spray that if I jumped in a Zambezi, I couldn't have gotten any wetter. Even the socks in my boots soaked through. It's phenomenal, especially when you're there during the rainy season. Now, on the centenary of David Livingstone sighting and mapping and measuring Victoria Falls, on the 16th of November 1955, they unveiled the iconic statue of David Livingstone at Victoria Falls on the Rhodesian side, what today is Zimbabwe. And this, I think, is the classic picture of David Livingstone. Bible in hand, walking or hiking cane, his hat with the flaps back to protect his neck and ears from sunburn. You can see something of Livingstone's character being portrayed through this phenomenally excellent monument. To achieve what David Livingstone did, he was decisive, goal-orientated, and inflexible. Reformed theology put doctrinal steel into his backbone. David Livingstone was a man of integrity, a man of his word. He said what he meant, and he meant what he said. He walked across many thousands of miles, across difficult, dangerous terrain, to return his porters to their village. Livingstone's first missionary journey, he walked from Cape Town, up through the Northern Cape, through what today is Botswana, across Zambia, across Angola. He got to Luanda, the capital port city of Angola. There was the British ship, the Forerunner, waiting in the harbour. He could have gotten the ship and in 3 weeks been with his family in Scotland. But he chose to go back across the continent that had almost killed him, take another 2 years to go across because he wanted to return his porters back to his village. Why? because all of Europe had abandoned the slave trade, made it illegal in 1815, except Portugal. Portugal was one country of Europe that still did slavery as late as the 1850s. And so Livingstone was concerned that the men who had helped him carrying his belongings and the taxes he had to pay to different tribes whose territory he passed through, that they might be enslaved either by the Portuguese or by one of the many tribes that they had to pass through the terrain. He walked them all the way back to their village because he didn't want their safety to be compromised. He had the compass and the maps, and he had the firearms, and so he thought he needed to escort his men back. How's that for integrity? David Livingstone understood the power of prayer. He had Holy Spirit fire in his heart, soul, and mind. He prayed the Psalms and he sang the Psalms daily. He was really a man of the Psalms. Livingstone had a great love for God's creation, for nature and for wildlife, and his books are filled with intricate sketches and fascinating details of the animals and the vegetation sited in Africa that are unique to Africa. The eland, the hippopotamus, the waterbuck, the baobab trees, which you can make so much out of, including sandals and rope, so much that you can get out of a baobab tree. The different implements used by the farmers, and the different body piercings, tattoos, earrings, nose rings, and other things that people wore, ankle bracelets. He had the detail of different types of hairstyles and different types of beards, different musical instruments, and different religious rituals people would do, like here, dance of the full moon, and how the bushmen used hollowed out ostrich eggs to fill them with water, with tufts of grass on the top, and then burying these ostrich eggs full of water in different key strategic places that have water at key times, and then carrying them in nets that they'd made. Livingstone saw the greatest herds of wildlife that probably has ever been seen across Africa, because sadly hunting has brought down Africa's wildlife to a fraction of what it once was. So he saw a lot of God's creation, and he gave the details of it and met some of the very dangerous creatures like the buffaloes, the crocodiles, the hippos, elephants, the leopards, cheetahs, the fastest animal in the world, engineered for speed, intelligent design in action. Yeah, magnificent creatures. And the lion. Now, Livingstone walked across Africa for 26 years. He has never attacked by a lion except when he picked a fight with a lion. He was taught by one chief in Botswana to shoot a local lion who was minding his own business. I mean, the lion was literally lying on a rock, and Livingstone walked up and shot the lion. The lion, with a bullet in his shoulder, still jumped on David Livingstone, crunched his shoulder bone, and just about mauled him to death before dying of the gunshot. So Livingstone was never attacked by a lion except when he drew first blood, when he picked a fight with a lion. He said later the stupidest thing he ever did in his life was picking a fight with a lion. You leave the lion alone, he'll leave you alone. But he said this chief was probably after the lion skin and happy to use the missionary's rifle to get it. He came up with the story that the lion was eating the goats, which is highly unlikely. From what we know of lions, they've got to be very sick to want to waste their time on a goat, when they can take zebras and impala and springbok. But anyway, magnificent animals, like the elephants. By the way, David Livingstone and others reported that there's snow on the equator. In what today is Tanzania and Kenya, there's snow on Mount Kenya and Mount Kilimanjaro. And people overseas did not believe this. People in Europe said, these missionaries are lying. You can't get snow in Africa, you can't get snow on the equator. That's impossible. Well, of course, now we know it's true, but at that time people did not believe them. But there is snow on the equator in Africa, much as it may not make sense to people outside. David Livingstone was inspired by a post-millennial eschatology of victory. He had a kingdom vision. David Livingstone understood the greatness of the Great Commission. He worked to comprehensively fulfill the Great Commission, ministering to body, mind, and spirit. As a medical doctor, he ministered to the body. As a teacher, he ministered to the mind, and as a preacher of the gospel, he ministered to the spirit. He was the first to apply modern practical medicine in much of Central Africa, and he was the first to preach the gospel across large swathes of what today is Zimbabwe, Zambia, and Malawi, and Tanzania. Wherever he went, he used his medical knowledge and training to heal bodies, his breadth of reading and learning, his deep faith and his knowledge of the Holy Scriptures to enrich and empower the people of Africa. The first page, or should we say the flyleaf, of missionary travels and researches in Southern Africa has a tsetse fly on it. As he said, the tsetse fly is more dangerous than the lion in the sense that the tsetse fly makes it almost impossible to travel in huge parts of these areas, and how the tsetse fly will kill your horses. There's some paintings of David Livingstone riding on a horse. That's fiction. He didn't take a horse on any of his journeys. The horse wouldn't have survived anyway. That's just imagination. The tsetse fly has its place there. I remember in bushcraft training, a game ranger said to me, "Praise God for the tsetse fly." Now, I've been bitten by tsetse fly, stung by tsetse fly, I should say, and it's very painful. But the tsetse fly has a purpose. All the great game reserves in Africa, whether you're talking about Serengeti, whether you're talking about Kruger National Park, Etosha Bay and Wankie, they wear tsetse flies rain. Farmers can't farm cattle where there's tsetse fly. And so the game reserves we've got are normally placed where there's tsetse fly. So praise God for tsetse fly. It's preserved parts of Africa for wildlife and for tourism, and we shouldn't complain even about the humblest of God's creatures. They've all got a place. But by the way, malaria, mosquitoes. How many of you have had malaria? I've certainly had malaria. Okay, do you know, when David Livingstone came to Africa, the prevailing medical consensus was malaria is caused by swamp fever. That's the etymology of the word. Mal area. Mal, bad, area, air. Malaria, bad air. David Livingstone was the first person to say mosquitoes caused malaria. And the scientists laughed at him and said, what can an insect have to do with the disease? This disease is from swamp fever. The solution, high ceilings. So in colonial areas they had high ceilings to let the bad air rise. The idea was malaria is caused by swamp fever. The closer to the river you are, the more likely you are to get swamp fever or malaria, bad air. But David Livingstone was so observant, he said, you'll only get malaria from mosquitoes, but not just any mosquito. A male mosquito can bite you, but only the female mosquito, when pregnant, can give you malaria. Now, have you noticed the difference between male and female mosquitoes? I haven't. Have you noticed the difference between a pregnant mosquito and a mosquito who's not pregnant? I haven't. Livingstone did. He said, if you are under your mosquito net from 11 o'clock at night till about 5 in the morning, you won't get malaria. You might get bitten by a mosquito, but you won't get malaria. Only between about 11 at night and 5 in the morning is the pregnant mosquito out laying her eggs, which can cause you malaria. And he's right. We now know Livingstone's correct. If you're under your mosquito net between 11 at night and 5 in the morning, you won't get malaria. That's how observant he was. Not only was he that observant, David Livingstone not only diagnosed the cause of malaria, he diagnosed the solution. When his ship had a foremast broken crossing the Atlantic in a storm, they went in to Rio de Janeiro on the Brazilian side of the Atlantic, while his ship got a new foremast, and he did explorations in the Amazon jungle, and he, as he always was inclined to, he took clippings of many different types of bushes, noting down details, and he got the quinine bush from Brazil, which he came and planted in Kuruman, and he found that the quinine bush is what is the perfect antidote to malaria. So way ahead of all the others, Livingstone identified the solution to malaria. Livingstone's rouser. I remember in Rhodesia having these bottles. When we got malaria, we got Livingstone's rouser. Quinine and rhubarb compound, and everyone in our missions had malaria, of course. Well, Livingstone pioneered the solution, and that's why he survived 26 years in the field. The average missionary to Africa in the 19th century died within 8 years. In some parts like West Africa, they died within 2 years of arriving. Livingstone survived 26 years in the field. Why? Because he had diagnosed how to treat malaria. Absolutely astounding. That's how observant he was. He tried so many different things. He guinea pigged on himself. You read in his travels, when he got attacked by the lion, he's putting down the symptoms. He said he felt nothing when the lion picked him up by the shoulder and shook him like a dog shakes a rat. And he says the shock that prevents him from feeling pain, he thinks this is a mercy from the Creator. That when an impala or a springbok is captured by a cheetah or lion, they don't feel pain initially. And that this is a mercy of the Creator. If you've cut yourself or you've fallen off your bicycle, you don't feel pain immediately. There's an initial shock. The pain comes later, isn't that right? So Livingstone noted down his symptoms and what worked and what didn't work. And he even went to witch doctor and said, how would you deal with this? And then he took his medicine, he analyzed it, he took it and he found, no, this didn't improve things. Then he tried quinine, he found, well, quinine's a solution to malaria. He did experimentation and observation. So a very observant man. David Livingstone teaches us that actions speak louder than words. He was described by his contemporaries as a man of resolute courage. Fire, water, stone wall would not stop Livingstone in the fulfillment of any recognized duty. Indeed, he did not let swamps or rivers or deserts or mountains prevent him from opening up Africa for the gospel. David Livingstone was determined to make a difference. The Great Commission was his supreme ambition. Christ's last command was his first concern. He wrote, I hope to be permitted to work as long as I live beyond other men's line of things, to plant the seed of the gospel where others have not planted. I am a missionary heart and soul. God had an only son, and he was a missionary and a physician. A poor imitation of him I am or wish to be. In his service I hope to live, in it I wish to die. I shall open up a path to the interior, or I will perish. May God bless us and make us blessings, even unto death. Shame upon us missionaries if we are to be outdone by slave traders. If the slave trader can get there, why can't the missionaries? Battling rains and chronic discomfort and rust and mildew and rot. All the canvas was rotting, all the metal things were rusting, totally drenched and fatigued, laid low by fever. On countless occasions, he had malaria at least 60 times. Livingstone continued to persevere across the continent. Trials tested the tenacity of the travel-weary team. And often David Livingstone endured excessive, unnecessary suffering and deprivation, hacking through dense jungle on foot, because lack of funds prevented him from affording the luxury of a canoe. I wouldn't have thought a canoe was a luxury. These privations, I beg you to observe, are not sacrifice, he said. I think that word ought never to be mentioned in reference to anything we can do for him, who though he was rich, yet for our sakes he became poor. The challenges of David Livingstone ring out to us today. Can that be called a sacrifice, which is simply paid back as a small part of a great debt owing to our God, which we can never repay? It is emphatically no sacrifice. Say rather, it is a privilege. David Livingstone, thank you, emphasized that sacrificial service is more powerful than eloquent sermons. We need to put feet to our faith. David Livingstone also alerted the world to the cancerous sore of the Islamic slave trade. It was missionary explorer David Livingstone whose graphic descriptions brought the ravages of the East African slave trade to light. His missionary travels and his Zambezi expedition narrative exposed the horrors of the slave trade, quoting, 2 of the women had been shot the day before for attempting to untie their thongs. 1 woman had her infant's brains knocked out because she could not carry her load and the baby. A man was dispatched with an axe because he had broken down with fatigue. Those taken out of the country are but a very small section of the sufferers. We never realized the atrocious nature of the traffic until we saw it at its fountainhead. There truly Satan has his seat. Besides those actually captured, thousands are killed and die of their wounds and famine, driven from their villages by the internecine war waged for slaves, with their own clansmen and neighbours, slain by the lust of gain, which is stimulated, be it remembered always, by the slave purchasers of Cuba and elsewhere. David Livingstone taught you cannot be neutral in the battles of life. He had the courage to confront evil. His fearless faith fought the good fight of faith. He set many thousands of captives free. Submit to God, resist the devil, he will flee from you. David Livingstone is an example of extraordinary patience and perseverance. He overcame every obstacle walking across the continent of Africa. Now, I've sometimes had people ask me, is such and such within walking distance? And my answer is yes. Everywhere in Africa is within walking distance. If you have enough time. David Livingstone proved that. He walked from Delgoa Bay, what today is Port Elizabeth, all the way up through Graaff-Reinet, which he said is the prettiest town in Africa, where he stayed with the Andrew Murray family, to Kuruman, in what today is the Northern Cape, the London Missionary Society base set up by Robert Moffat. He walked across what today is Botswana. He walked all the way back to the Cape Colony, to Cape Town. He placed his family on a ship to return to Britain. Then he walked from Cape Town across the whole of the Cape Province, through what is today Botswana, Zambia, and Angola, to the port of Luanda. He walked from the Atlantic Ocean, across the continent of Africa, across Angola, Zambia, Zimbabwe, and Mozambique to the Indian Ocean. First person to walk across the continent from ocean to ocean. I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. In Livingstone's book, he's got this cross-section of the continent of Africa showing, no, it's not a desert in the middle. He's explaining what the terrain is, what the vegetation is, what the climate is, what the type of stone and soil is. And he measured the altitudes continually with the thermometer in the boiling water. So making calculations across the continent. A lot of these calculations he made while sick with fever. And when we compare his cross-section, his maps, with what we know today, he's accurate. He came back to Africa and explored much of the Zambezi River, the Shiri Valley, and the Rovuma River. He walked across what is today Mozambique, Malawi, Tanzania, and Zimbabwe. Yet in all these things we are more than conquerors through Christ Jesus who loved us. On his third great missionary journey, he walked across the whole length of Tanzania, much of Mozambique, Malawi, and Zambia, the Congo, Burundi. He finally died on his knees in prayer in the province of Luapula in northern Zambia, where his heart is buried. In his 30 years of dedicated missionary service in Africa, he walked from coast to coast across what are today 12 vast countries. He walked across a country that did not yet have roads, bridges, or purified water. I will try to hold myself in readiness to go anywhere, provided it be forwards, he said. David Livingstone teaches us the power of the printed page. It was books that he read, such as Practical Christianity by William Wilberforce, which channeled much of his life in dedicated labours to eradicate the slave trade and open up Africa for the gospel. Practical Christianity by William Wilberforce was a phenomenal inspiration for him, which made him one of the greatest abolitionists, one of the greatest campaigners against slavery in history. Livingstone wrote missionary travels in the Zambezi expedition and his journals, which inspired generations of missionaries to dedicate their lives to winning Africa for Christ, including Mary Slessor. Livingstone's dedicated, steadfast example inspired Mary Slessor to devote her life to Calabar, what today is Nigeria. And Peter Cameron was inspired to launch the Africa Inland Mission. Mary Slessor, I should say, came from an even more poverty-stricken background in Scotland than Livingstone. David Livingstone at least had parents who loved him. Mary Slessor had a drunkard of a father who abused her. So Mary Slessor was even poorer than Livingstone was. Peter Cameron returned from African failure after his first mission, but when he read the inscription on the tomb of David Livingstone in Westminster Abbey, "Other sheep I have which are not of this fold, them also I must bring. They will hear my voice." It's written on the left side of his tomb. Cameron was rebuked. He was inspired, and he resolved to return to Africa, and he launched the Africa Inland Mission, which is today one of the biggest churches in East Africa, Africa Inland Church. Now, you've seen the Queen's funeral recently. I'm sure, and maybe the wedding of Catherine and William in 2011. Notice there's one grave that's not covered by the red carpet. David Livingstone's tomb is right at the entrance to Westminster Abbey. He's got the premier spot. When you are walking into Westminster Abbey, you've got to walk around that. So Africa has a prime spot in this very historic abbey. Livingstone knew the power of the printed page. He knew the power of public speaking tours. He focused on the universities as strategic for mobilizing reformers and missionaries to fulfill the Great Commission. In fact, Malawi was evangelized by the university's mission, which was inspired by David Livingstone speaking at the universities of St. Andrews and Glasgow and Edinburgh. And Bishop Mackenzie came out particularly to Malawi as a result of Livingstone's challenge. Livingstone saw rivers as God's highway to reach Africa for Christ. Now, you might see a river as an obstacle, and they are an obstacle. To get across rivers is a great challenge. But he saw rivers as God's highways. All communities need access to water. Rivers are a strategic artery which missionaries should utilize to fulfill the Great Commission. This month, Frontline Fellowship is sending a missionary up to the Congo, a naval commander who is launching a Congo River mission. He's been the full length of the Congo River and is trying to launch a full-time mission to reach the villages on the side of the Congo River. 14 million people live on the Congo River or its tributaries, a vast unreached area that needs evangelism. So there's still people seeing the need to utilize rivers for the fulfillment of the Great Commission. David Livingstone believed in leadership training. His vision was actually to establish Bible colleges for Africans to be trained as evangelists, teachers, missionaries to disciple the nations. So he had the vision of Back to the Bible mission before there was a Back to the Bible mission. But his mission, London Missionary Society, forbade him to do that. They did not think the time was right. They didn't think it was possible. So Livingstone was frustrated in his plan to open up Bible colleges. But he then did an even greater thing of opening up Africa for many missionaries to come. The life and legacy of David Livingstone has taught me the importance of discipline, exercise, reading, a Christian work ethic, temperance, self-control, self-denial, and to be duty-orientated. The post-millennial eschatology of victory of David Livingstone has inspired me that we are not working at uncertainty. The Lord who gave us the Great Commission will ensure that it is fulfilled. It was me adopting a post-millennial eschatology of victory, or vision of victory, that the Great Commission will be fulfilled before the Lord returns. That enabled me to go to theological college, to get married, to have children, to raise a family, to build a mission, to establish a mission base, to do a whole lot of things which are long-term, which I wouldn't have done if I'd stayed with my rapture fever end times obsession. God's promises and God's power are fully sufficient to empower His church to fulfill His Great Commission, making disciples of all nations, teaching obedience to all things the Lord has commanded. David Livingstone's comprehensive view of fulfilling the Great Commission, ministering to body, mind, and spirit, has raised the standards of missionary service for all of us. It is a rebuke to religious tourism. A lot of people today, they go on a short-term religious tourism trip somewhere, gone there, done that, got the t-shirt, get a few selfies, and they think that's missions. Well, David Livingstone's view of missions raises the standard way above religious tourism. Actions speak louder than words. Sacrificial service is more powerful than eloquent sermons. We must put feet to our faith. We must recognize we're in a world war of worldviews. And by the way, looking at this picture reminds me of diamonds. David Livingstone was first based at Kuruman, Northern Cape. He saw diamonds lying on the ground, and he was well read. He had an interest in geology. He knew exactly what he was picking up. He picked up diamonds, he threw them in the bush and said nothing about them. Later, when David Livingstone was met by Henry Morton Stanley, the American journalist, Dr. Livingstone, I presume, Stanley brought letters for him to read. And David Livingstone hadn't received letters in years. But he said, I've been taught patience, I can wait a few hours. Tell me the news. How's the world getting on? Will you ask a journalist what's going on? You've asked the right person. So Henry Morton Stanley gave him an update on the world news. The Suez Canal is open. You can now travel by ship through the Mediterranean and the Red Sea to the Indian Ocean without going around the Cape of Good Hope. General Grant's now president of the United States. The Pacific Railroad across the whole of the continent of America from coast to coast has been completed. Prussia has defeated Denmark and France in war. Prussia being the forerunner of Germany. The first transatlantic cable has been laid, permitting immediate communication between North America and Europe. And diamonds have been discovered in South Africa, Northern Cape. David Livingstone nodded. I wondered how long it would take them. And so the word came out decades later that David Livingstone knew about the diamonds in Northern Cape, but he never said anything about it. Why not? Greatest diamond fields in the world. I mean, imagine how rich Livingstone could have been if he had sold those diamonds or established a mine there. And David Livingstone said, I'd found the pearl of great price. I wasn't going to get sidetracked into diamonds. Why didn't you sell the diamonds to help your missionary work? I couldn't have done it, he said. These were the most precious diamonds the world had ever seen. Valuable. A diamond rush would have started. We were still trying to evangelize the China people. We didn't even have church established amongst them. Imagine if all the vice that would come with the miners, the drink and the saloons and the gambling and all that, what would happen to the China people? We were still trying to evangelize them. The church wasn't ready. So imagine the discipline, resisting the temptation to sell that diamond or to make wealth for himself. David Livingstone threw the diamonds away because he had the pearl of great price. He had the gospel. He had the Great Commission. He wasn't going to get sidetracked by diamonds. Now, how's that for a vision? Livingstone also teaches us that Islam is a threat to faith and freedom. You cannot be neutral in the battles of life. You need to confront evil. You need to fight the good fight of faith. You need to be bold, to be brave, to be courageous. You must be patient and steadfast, and we need to persevere. We need to overcome every obstacle. We need to go forward in the faith. Never forget the power of the printed page. Invest in books. Read. Teach your people to love reading. Readers make leaders. A reading Christian is a growing Christian. Do not forget the schools, the colleges and universities. They are strategic. We must disciple the next generation to be faithful to the Word of God and to be effective in God's service. We need to think strategically as to how we can reach the nations for Christ. We need to make our life count for eternity. In the words of the great cricketer turned pioneer missionary, C.T. Studd, you only have one life. It will soon be past. Only what's done for Jesus Christ will last. As the father of modern missions, William Carey, said, expect great things from God, attempt great things for God. So what would David Livingstone say to us today? What he said before his last missionary journey. I beg to direct your attention to Africa. I know that in a few years I shall be cut off from that country which is now open. Do not let it be shut again. I go back to Africa to try to make an open path for commerce and Christianity. Will you carry out the work which I've begun? I leave it with you. Also I heard the voice of the Lord saying, whom shall I send and who will go for us? And I answered, here am I, Lord, send me. This message is available on our Frontline website, www.frontlinemissionsa.org, video and audio and PowerPoints and article. It's also part of our Great Commission Handbook and the Great Essential Missions book. We will be handing out manuals, which has got this as the first chapter. If we could have class captains help us distribute. I've got over there a manual for everybody, every student. We printed 85 copies of the Christian History of Africa manual. Class captains? Good. If you can please distribute these, make sure everyone gets one. If everyone can stay in their seats, that will help us to do this effectively. Now, any questions, any comments, any challenges? I might tell you that I've started a website called livingstonefellowship.co.za, and on it I've got articles in different languages, digital and discipleship resources, a lot of sermons and sermon audio links, including to a summary of every book in the Bible. One sermon summarizing a full book of the Bible. There's a range of Bible studies, sermons, resources, and links to all sorts of different useful things. This livingstonfellowship.co.za website is to help continue the work of David Livingstone. If you're looking for sermon notes, sermon ideas, resources, evangelistic things, tracts in different languages, go onto livingstonfellowship.co.za. You'll get a lot of useful material. We also started a website called Livingstone 200. I started this in 2013 on the 200th anniversary of David Livingstone's birth. And so you will find links to the writings of David Livingstone, pictures, his museums, monuments around the world. So you'll find that useful as well. We also have a Facebook page. If you're on Facebook, Dr. David Livingstone Facebook page, you'll find I put a lot of memory things on this day, pictures and articles and links connected with David Livingstone. Our mission headquarters in Cape Town is called Livingstone House, named after Dr. David Livingstone. If you go to Glasgow and Blantyre, there are statues, monuments to David Livingstone, their greatest son, sowing the seed of the Word of God. And at Blantyre, there's a horrible monument. It depicts David Livingstone being attacked by this lion. I think it's very mean, unfair, anti-lion propaganda, because it doesn't show the rifle in David Livingstone's hand. It makes it out like the lion's just attacking a man while he's minding his own business, which does not happen. And this is a dramatic statue, but still, I just think it's extremely unfair to blame the lion, considering Livingstone, after all, did shoot the lion first. He picked the fight. If you go to Ujiji in Tanzania, has anyone here been to Ujiji? Anyone come from Tanzania? Right. Well, at Ujiji, they've got this memorial to where, under this mango tree which stood here, Henry Morton Stanley met David Livingstone the 10th of November 1871. On the 100th anniversary of the death of David Livingstone, Zambia brought out this postage stamp commemorating David Livingstone chasing the Arab slave traders out of Zambia. If you go to northern Zambia, Chitambo's village, they have got a memorial to where David Livingstone died. He was found by his followers on his knees praying by the side of his bed in a hut. And they said, this is a great man. His body should be taken back to his people to be buried in his country, but his heart belongs in Africa. So they took out his heart and buried his heart at the foot of the tree. And this is where the tree was. So Livingstone's heart is buried under this. And we've been there too. The monument occupies a spot where formerly stood the tree at the foot of which Livingstone's heart was buried by his faithful followers. On the trunk was carved the following inscription: David Livingstone, May the 4th, 1873, Chuma Susie. Interestingly, some of the wood of the tree under which his heart was buried was later made into a cross, put in Christ Cathedral at Zanzibar. Has anyone here been to Zanzibar? Very few people have been to Zanzibar. Great. Have you been to Christ Cathedral? So this cathedral was built on the site where the slave market used to be, and the high altars where the auction block used to be. And on the altars, a wooden cross, which is made from the wood of the tree under which Livingstone's heart was buried. I have many first editions of David Livingstone's books at Livingstone House, and including his Zambezi expedition, and Henry Morton Stanley's books like In Darkest Africa. These are very valuable, very precious books. And we've got a lot of Livingstone's writings. I've participated in producing a school textbook, Livingstone, Man of Prayer and Action. In Livingstonia, in Zambia, there are monuments to David Livingstone. I counted 8 monuments to David Livingstone just in the city of Livingstonia in Zambia in 2013. On the 100th anniversary of the birth of David Livingstone, on the 200th anniversary, I should say. There's Livingstone School, there's Livingstone Museum, and they have monuments at each. And then in 2005, Zambia put up a statue to David Livingstone on the Zambian side, and In 2011, they put up a monument to David Livingstone and two of his faithful followers, Susie and Truma, outside the international airport at Livingstone. A very nice monument indeed. You can be in the middle of Malawi or Zambia and suddenly see something like a historic tree. Under this tree, David Livingstone rested. And we started the Livingstone 200 movement in 2013. And from our mission headquarters in Cape Town, we sent our team out across, following the steps of Livingstone, distributing 3.5 tons of Bibles and books in places where he pioneered the gospel, and following up on the great work he did, showing the Jesus film, having evangelistic meetings and training programs, seminars. And it was a magnificent opportunity, going as far as Sudan, distributing libraries for pastors, study Bibles, all to celebrate the Livingstone 200 bicentennial. The ultimate was we had a Livingstone 200 missions conference at the city of Livingstone in Zambia, which I led. And we had the Zambian national TV, the Zambian radio there. We lectured at the Livingstone Teacher Training College. We had national TV and the mayor's office at our event. And it was a very, very hot day. Somebody offered to hold an umbrella over me, and I said, no, thank you. I don't think I could honor David Livingstone standing in the shade. I was told, why didn't you take your suit jacket off? And I said, I can't do that. Livingstone was dressed smartly walking across Africa. You can't honor him by dressing sloppily on this day. It was so hot. Honestly, my suit was so soaked with sweat. I don't think it would have got any wet if I jumped into the river. This is Sunday service at the local Anglican Church, Church of England, where we commemorated David Livingstone. I produced the Livingstone 200 audiovisual MP3 recorder. That's his signature, and that's his boots after crossing Africa. I must say, they made boots better then. These days, I've bought brand new boots, and it's fallen apart on my first hike up Tate Mountain. So there's something wrong with the boots they're making today. His boots could walk across Africa for 26 years. Okay, you had to do some repairs, but still. So, visit the Livingstone 200 website, look at the Great Ascension Missions book, and everything I've just told you this morning is in the first chapter of the book you've got. You can put your name on the book, it's yours to keep. You can make notes in the margin. This is what we're going to be dealing with during this week. And of course, you can find more on our frontlinemissionsa.org website.